Well, it's that magical time of year again. The kids are going back to school. The oppressive summer heat is starting to fade away. The leaves look like they're thinking, maybe considering starting to turn. And then the most important aspect of this time of year is the beginning of college football. I absolutely love college sports. I've been following the team that would later on become my alma mater ever since I can really remember. I was just kind of born into a family of people who love the NC State Wolfpack, for better or for worse. You know, one of the things that's always been interesting to me about college sports is how insatiable the appetites of college fans can truly be. You know, things are never really enough, and I think there's something about the fact that many people experience a, college team for a limited set number of years that really makes people say, I can never get enough. I always need something else. Things are always changing. If you think about it, just kids coming in and out of the roster due to being students and then graduating or transferring or whatever, it causes a lot of change in the program. And as a result of that, there's always ebbs and flows of talent, good years and bad years. And a lot of times what college fans will do is they'll end up experiencing a few years of success. And then all of a sudden they get that little taste of something that maybe they didn't even think was possible. And they say, well, why can't I have more? Well, I'm not being unreasonable. I mean, we ended up being ranked the past few years. Why can't I get a conference title now? Well, I got a conference title. Why am I not getting a national title? I've always found it interesting whenever you have programs that are successful programs like in Alabama, and they'll sit here and go to the college football playoffs, and then in the following year, they'll end up, only barely making the college football playoffs, and there are people legitimately asking for the head of the college coach. Maybe it's these insatiable appetites that leads to the fact that, statistically, college FBS coaches, at least the last time I looked it up, their average tenure at any given institution was only around 4 years. What's also interesting about that is that there's another profession that the average tenure is about 4 years: senior pastors. You see, senior pastors actually typically only stay at any given church for a national average of 4 years because a lot of times people end up being very insatiable. They see things that they like that are going on. They see the stability a new pastor brings, or maybe the success of some programs or some events, and they start saying, I want more, I want more, I want more. And when they don't get that more, all of a sudden they have to find someone to heap their disappointment onto, and that becomes the pastor. And the pastors end up inevitably having a fallout, typically after 4 or 5 years, and then the cycle continues. We all have things like this in our lives that we latch onto, and they're not all horrible things. I mean, some of them are things that we may have that are hobbies in our lives. They may be things that are our careers that are good. They may be things that are very noble, like our families. Being a good husband, being a good wife, being a good mother, being a good father or a grandparent, or whatever it is. These are things that are noble, but they're all things that can ultimately, at some point in time, take over. They can be things that become a little bit too important, maybe. When I think about an individual who in all facets of his life seemed like he was winning, it was Solomon. So Solomon was an individual that, he hit a point where, he had a pretty awesome home life. He had his wives, and I did say that plural, that's a different lesson. He did have political power. He was very well respected with his peers, other rulers in other nations. He had a secure governmental apparatus. In addition to that, he was just dummy rich. According to some estimates, he was at his peak, I think, net worth around $2 trillion. That's just a mind-boggling amount of money to think about, just trying to spend it. There were individuals in my lab just the other day during my day job who were actually sitting around talking about a far smaller amount of money, saying, if I wanted to spend all that money in my lifetime, how would I do it? And you know what? They couldn't even comprehend how they would spend these large sums of money. But yet Solomon had achieved it all. Well, what's interesting is that he achieved it all, and just like we talked about with our college fan, or just like we talked about with our church member, he found all of these things to be utterly meaningless. He had achieved the pinnacle of what they could possibly be, and found that none of these things filled the God-shaped hole in his heart. The only thing that can fill that God-shaped hole is God. We always have to be certain that we are being cautious against prioritizing these other things in our life as being too high or too important, because ultimately what's going to happen are all of these things are going to be something that we can never really be satisfied with. We can always achieve more. We can always have more wealth. We can always be more popular. We can always have better programs around us. We can always have a better family unit and more polished kids or a public image or whatever. But none of those things are ever going to leave us satisfied. The only thing that is going to leave us satisfied is the one thing that fits that God-shaped hole in our hearts. Now, I want to be careful that I'm not being too unfair towards the hobbies and pursuits that individuals may have. I actually had a teenager come up to me when I was still doing youth ministry who asked me this question that on the face of it was almost a little funny, but there was actually something very kind of deep and profound that he was asking. He came up to me after hearing a lesson talking about how we should prioritize God in our lives, and then the hierarchy of things we're concerned about, our mission, our calling, what God wants should always be at the top. And he came up to me and said, "So, are you saying that God doesn't want me to play basketball because that's not focusing on Him?" And, that's something that just in a vacuum, it's funny in the same way that you hear something that's kind of like an innocent question from somebody, and it's kind of humorous. But, it's kind of a legitimate question, because sometimes I think that there is this aspect, this philosophy within Christianity that says you should deny yourself all things around you and all pleasures and all pursuits, because the only thing that matters is God, and therefore you should cast away all these other things you have in your life. And really, that's truly inconsistent with what we see in the lives of so many different people in the Old and New Testament, and what we see Solomon, the individual who just said the pursuit of these things was meaningless, what we see him say. You see, Solomon actually ends up taking the stance that these things are blessings that we have from God, our talents, our abilities, even including some of the wealth and material goods that we have, the people we have in our lives, our family. These are blessings that we have, so we should enjoy these things that were given to us from God. The catch is in not confusing the blessing from the blesser. You see, the blesser is the individual who will never change. The blesser is the individual who will fill that God-shaped hole in our hearts. But the blessings, while they're for us to enjoy, are things that can let us down. Our talents can eventually fade away, our wealth can dry up. Even when you think about families can have their own problems and own dysfunction. And if we have seeded the joy of our hearts with the blessings, then when those things fade away or begin to tarnish a little bit, all of a sudden, we don't know who we are. All of a sudden, we start feeling lost. However, if we're able to maintain a focus on not the blessing, but the blesser, then even when those individual blessings start fading away or start looking a little bit worse for wear, we still hold joy in our hearts. And that is how, even through the bad times, we're able to continue marching forward with a sense and an attitude of joy, because we are seeding our joy with the individual who is the blesser and not with the fleeting blessing. I don't want to act like everything is all rainbows and gumdrops, because clearly it's not. We could talk about blessings, and blessings are awesome. They're definitely a lot more popular to talk about than it is to talk about, things like conviction or sin or pain or death or whatever. But the reality is that pain and suffering is a part of life. We're all going to end up dealing with it. Sometimes the pain and suffering that hurts the most is the pain and suffering that comes from something that we thought previously was a blessing. It's in those moments that it becomes very important that our joy is found in the blesser and not in the blessing, as we just discussed. But yet the pain and suffering happens, and when it happens, there's something that we see throughout the Old and New Testament it reveal in people's lives, and that is the limitation of themselves. That people are finite beings and that they can't prevent all the bad things in the world from happening to them. It'd be awesome if we could. It'd be awesome if we could go back with 20/20 hindsight and say, if I had just done this one thing different, everything would have been perfectly fine, and then we could avoid making all mistakes in the future. But I haven't met the soul yet who's capable of doing that. And so we find ourselves right here, being finite, not actually having the ability to totally save ourselves from anything that we're going through. But there is a blessing that's hidden in that pain and suffering, and that is the fact that in those moments when we decrease, suddenly we start seeing God increase. We start realizing not the finite, but the infinite nature of God and His ability to overcome all things, no matter how daunting they may seem to us. This is something that you guys will read here in a second that Paul talks about. He talks about a pain in his side, and in doing this, you see him invoke this image of the fact that through his weakness, he is able to see the magnification of the glory of Christ. Because while he looks at himself and says, I cannot, he sees in that cannot that Jesus can. There is no shortage of things in this world that are meaningless. All of the different blessings we may enjoy, all the different pursuits we may go after, all of the different noble causes we may be attached to that the rest of society and the world would say are good, noble causes, none of those things are sufficient to give us what we truly crave. What we crave is something that is not finite. What we crave is something that doesn't tarnish and wear away. What we crave is something that doesn't fall away as soon as a mistake is made. What we crave is Jesus Christ. It's something you can see in the pain and the hurting of so many individuals. It's something that so many of us have experienced within our own lives, that sense of hurt and pain that can only truly be cured by the intervention of Jesus Christ. This is something that Solomon talked extensively about in Ecclesiastes. It's what we just talked about right here. There's no shortage of things that are meaningless, but there is only one thing that truly matters, and that is Jesus Christ. Thankfully, no matter what we're going through, whether that's something that is pain and hurt, whether that's something that is a struggle, a temptation, whether that's something that's a victory that may cause us to become cocky and arrogant about something, Christ is always going to be sufficient. He is always going to be enough for whatever we need in whatever season that we find ourselves in. This is what we'll be going over for the next several weeks. I hope you're able to get something out of this today. And as we go throughout the following week, what I hope you can all think about is, what are those things in our lives that maybe we're dedicating ourselves to that we may one day find out are meaningless? And where are we placing the blesser who will always be truly enough? Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.